I want to ask you to begin by talking about Ukraine and the particular role that Palantir has had since almost immediately after the Russian invasion in 2022 in working with Ukraine to try to give it technologies that could help it resist Russia. Just talk about how that began in 2022, and then we'll talk about where things are now.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, David. Yes, so our involvement in Ukraine on the battlefield began around May of 2022. So this is, you'll remember, only a few short weeks after the beginning of the conflict. And it came about because the Ukrainians actually reached out to us and invited our CEO and founder, Alex Karp, to Kiev. And he very bravely accepted. This is barely 10 weeks after the beginning of the war, and the Battle of Kiev had only very recently ended. And so he and I set off on that trip, and we met with President Zelensky. And Zelensky made us a very compelling offer, which was, he's obviously a very charismatic man, and he painted this picture of a Ukraine that would be, he described, like the Israel of Europe. So it would be surrounded by a country that desired to wipe it off the map for the foreseeable future, and therefore this was going to be a long, generational struggle. And that Ukraine would need to take a leaf out of Israel's book and learn how to form these international partnerships with other nations, form those alliances. But also it would need security alliances with industrial partners. And that they had identified Palantir as the premier mil-tech company in the world. And they wanted us to come and help on the battlefield. They wanted our software. And part of the, if you like, the offer in return, as well as the opportunity to make a difference and do the right thing, was this very, very talented bench of engineering that Ukraine has. And that many of these young men and women were now in uniform, and that they would be ready and able to build on our software and begin to wield it in ways that perhaps our other military customers around the world had not. And Alex said yes, and it began as an entirely philanthropic endeavor. And it then fell to me to build up our presence there and in effect kind of bootstrap that first instance of the software and work with the armed forces in Ukraine to make all of that work. And very quickly, that vision that President Zelensky had started to come true. And we encountered engineers that we would be thrilled to hire. I mean, truly, truly exceptional talent. And of course, working with an ethic that can only come from an existential situation like that, where building a new feature and deploying that might make the difference between saving a friend's life. And that sense of urgency was not something that we had really encountered before in almost any context. And so combination of talent and urgency started this extraordinary journey that we've been on then for the last 3.5 years or so, where, of course, the battlefield, as you'll all well know, has evolved tremendously from a technological point of view, but where the software has then had to keep up with each of those developments. And we've been very privileged to play a part in that.
So I should make clear that this visit to Ukraine, traveling with Louis, the Washington Post has paid David's travel expenses, but it's been an unusual opportunity to see a company at the center of this effort to build up Ukraine's technological capability, and that became especially clear yesterday in your meeting, which I was able to oversee with the new defense minister of Ukraine, Mikhailo Fedorov. And Louis, just say a word about what was publicly announced by Ukraine yesterday. They're calling it a data room, but it will allow them, working with you, to use what is probably the world's most extraordinary library of sensor data, audio, video, signals of every kind about the age of autonomous warfare that's now begun. So just walk us through what you're going to help them do and what difference it might make.
Absolutely. So what they have, of course, collected over the past 4 years is, as David says, this extraordinary library. And it's really an asset, this data asset of myriad different kinds of data sources. You can think of thousands, tens of thousands, even millions of hours of footage from drones, signals data, satellite imagery, audio, radio frequency signatures, and so forth. And as we're moving, as David said, into this era of more and more autonomy on the battlefield, that requires artificial intelligence at the edge on those assets, on drones, for example. And that means the AI needs to be trained on real data. It needs to have learned from something like this library, this data room, as the Ukrainians are calling it. And theirs, of course, is completely unique in the world. There is no other country that has, sadly, that data asset. And so they are uniquely positioned to begin to exploit it, which they are doing. They use our software to curate that library, to synthesize that data and normalize it, and then begin to train and develop the algorithms that will then be used in those autonomous weapon systems. And of course, the big challenge that Ukraine has really is in the end one of scale and mass. They're facing an adversary that is 3 or 4 times larger in population, far larger industrial base, a much greater ability to stay in the fight. So they need to find ways of leveling that imbalance. And of course, technology is the way you do that. That's how you get more output for less input. And this is a great example where they are, of course, they have to take far, far greater care of the human resources they have. They can't afford to sacrifice people in the way that Russia is. And therefore, that move towards autonomy on the battlefield is essential for enabling them to stay in the fight.
This would be a good time for you to explain just what it is that Palantir's software does, how it allows. You can take the example we're discussing if you want, this library of data, and make it more usable. How does it do that? How does your software operate?
So you could think of it really as an operating system for data. So it enables large complex organizations that will have collected data of myriad different kinds, scattered across dozens, hundreds, even thousands of source systems. So in the military context, these could be sensors, these would be radars, these would be satellites, that kind of thing, drones. Yeah. How do you begin to make sense of all of that information? How do you assemble it into a virtual representation of that physical reality, which can then be exploited by AI? The challenge you're always going to have with AI, if you let it loose on that data, is if it is not managed and not organized, not orchestrated correctly, then the AI will be partial, it will make mistakes, it will hallucinate, it will not perform at the level you need it to. And so that synthesis of that entire data landscape into what we call an ontology, you could think of that a bit like a data model or a digital twin, the virtual representation of the physical reality is essential. It's how you make AI safe and usable. And so that's what we provided to the Ukrainians in the military context. But the same paradigm applies actually to any large complex organization. And it is in fact the same software being used for healthcare systems, for example. But of course, the ontology, instead of looking like a tank or an aircraft or a drone, those objects, it's a patient, a clinician, a treatment.
So Palantir is a controversial company, it's fair to say. Critics of Palantir argue that this extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary technology capability is being used for military purposes, intelligence purposes. In the case of ICE, is being used to help identify and deport people from the United States. How would you respond as a longtime employee of the company, senior executive, to people who are critics?
Well, Palantir was founded with a strong mission focus. I think it is fair to say it's a company with an ideology which could probably be simplified to Palantir was set up to ensure that the West wins, the West broadly defined, of course. And that means making sure that the institutions of the West are the most powerful, the most competitive version of themselves. And that really the story of Western Western advantage is really one of technical advantage, and that we need to perpetuate that technical advantage for another generation or two if we want to maintain our way of life and our value systems in the West. And that really was why Palantir was set up. Now, as part of that, it means that we are willing to do very controversial work, like you described with ICE. I mean, I would qualify that with saying we began actually working with ICE under President Obama, and that work has continued through the changes of government under Trump 1, under Biden, and now under Trump 2. We're not party political. So where a government has a democratic mandate, there is in effect public consent for a policy, we would see it as our duty to help deliver that. We think that is core to ultimately the success of these institutions, is that their legitimacy is a function of their competence. And our role is to ensure that they can be the most competent versions of themselves. But it's that commitment, I think, to fulfilling a democratic mandate. That's to say, if a policy has been agreed at the ballot box and agreed in the courtroom, then it's, if you like, almost our duty as Palantir to support it. We're not going to play politics, is the crucial point. But it does mean that we will at times do things that are very politically controversial.
You and I talked during our trip about an unusual engagement in Britain where you were asked recently to help the Metropolitan Police in London, which had a problem of internal affairs is the euphemism, but it's basically internal corruption, and turned to Palantir, and that was publicly announced. Say a bit about that, and also about the ways in which we talked about the TV show Line of Duty, where you're trying to figure out who the good cops and the bad cops are. The way in which your tools can help a police department or any organization find out who's really serving the public and who isn't.
Well, I think we now work with a handful of police forces in the UK, and it's been, for me, some of the most extraordinary and meaningful work that we've undertaken anywhere. The police in the UK, and I think in many, many countries, struggle with an enormous administrative burden, and their resources are stretched very thin and across a vast waterfront and caseload. And so they are almost uniquely positioned to benefit from artificial intelligence as it now exists, that can help to ease that burden, that administrative burden, and allow police officers to focus on really what they signed up to do, which is solve crimes. So in the UK, it's quite common to have to, as a police officer, to log in to dozens of systems when you're trying to find information on a suspect, and there'll be bits of information that's kept in different systems. And that's very, very time consuming. So already the ability to bring together that information and synthesize it in the way that I described in the military context is a huge productivity uplift. But then as you begin to be able to layer on AI, so imagine you've arrested a group of individuals, all of whom have devices of different kinds, mobile phones, laptops. Often they'll have 2 or 3 each. So very quickly you might have dozens of these devices, each of which might have tens of thousands of photos on them, or millions and millions of messages in chat rooms. How do you very quickly crawl through all of that information to identify evidence of criminality, suspected criminality, or that the individual might have been in this location when the crime might have happened? And that's the kind of legwork in an investigatory sense that AI is really able now to do. And of course, it's not making the decision, it is surfacing something that looks of interest or suspicious, which then the police officer can come and using their professional judgment, take a view. But it cuts an enormous amount of time. And we're seeing, the time it takes to build those kind of suspect profiles improve 80, 90%. I mean, it's a scale of productivity unlock that I think is almost unheard of in the public sector.
So I can see the productivity gain. I have to be honest, thinking about software crawling through all of my devices and looking at all my photos and all the messages I sent is a scary image. So I think the question is, given the power of this tool and of AI in general, how are we going to have anything that we could call privacy, when we come up against police departments, government agencies. Washington Post journalist's home was raided within the last week, and that journalist's devices were seized by the police. We were told Post is not a suspect in this, but those devices and everything that's there potentially could be at risk. How do we avoid a really catastrophic loss of privacy in the world that you're helping build out?
Well, that actually goes right back to the genesis of Palantir. So we were founded in the wake of the so-called war on terror, born of a concern that you'll remember very well, the argument then being, in order to keep Western countries safe, organizations charged with our security would need to start to have access to all kinds of private information. And the founders of Palantir felt that was going to compromise the very thing that those organizations were charged with protecting. And that actually, if you gave those organizations better technology, you could push the frontier out of that trade-off. This idea that there was a one-to-one trade-off between security and privacy and civil liberties. Every little bit extra of security you wanted, you were going to have to lose some of your privacy or your civil liberties, was just wrong. With the right technology, you could have more of both. You could enhance both. And that was why Palantir was founded. And I think it's been borne out throughout the last 20 years of our existence that is the case. And the way, for example, in that police context, it may, as you say, it may sound like a scary surveillance prospect, but actually, of course, what's happening technologically is every single one of those steps is auditable, captured transparently in a way that if someone were ever to do something that they are not legally entitled to do, you would have a perfect track record of that. And that, I think, is actually an enormous improvement in lots of cases from the world that we've lived in for a long time, where we're reliant on pen and paper and then emails, which are much harder to audit, much harder to understand who accessed what information, when, under what conditions, with what permissions. So I think it's actually counterintuitive as it may sound. We are a big part of the answer to that fear of the dystopian future that you described.
Take another issue that you and I chatted about, an industry that has a noble tradition, loves its past practices, sometimes is lovably but counterproductively disorganized, is my business, the news business. And it's been publicly disclosed that you have been hired by Fox News to help them look at their systems so that their journalists do a better job of covering the news. And this apparently is of interest to lots of other news organizations. Talk a little bit about what Palantir would do with all the different streams of information and organization function that are part of a news organization.
It's one of the very exciting new industries that we're finding. There's a big appetite for our software, and really the story of Palantir, the first 10 years are this focus on intelligence and defense, national security, and more recently we've begun to expand into the corporate sector, and particularly in America, where we're seeing this extraordinary growth. Over the last 12 months, the revenue in our corporate business has grown 121% in North America, and it is being driven by organizations in every sector, but media is a good example. So again, this is the same paradigm actually that I described on the battlefield or in the police station. Journalists are typically waking up every morning and, what am I going to write today? How do I crawl through the dozens of different websites and news sources that I regularly consult to understand what's going on today and who's writing about what, and decide. Again, that's something that AI can start to synthesize for a journalist, surface what might be of interest. Again, always leaving it to the journalist to use their professional judgment to decide what to write, but cutting the time it takes to do that research. And then at the other end, once they've drafted an article, for example, all of those tiresome jobs that have typically taken hours and hours of newsroom time, whether that's sub-editing or finding the right picture or adding the metadata or the links, all of that now can be done instantly by AI. So a journalist drafts their article, it's then fact-checked, spell-checked, style guide checks, links added, photos suggested, videos clipped. So the time to publish shrinks very dramatically and, of course, increases the volume and I think also the quality of journalism at the same time.
You know, I'll leave it to the audience to decide whether that's a glorious prospect or absolutely terrifying. A last question, Louis, is a great big one, but I'm sure everybody in this audience has thought about it. As we enter this age of artificial intelligence, superintelligence, maybe soon, enabled in part by what Palantir can do, there's a growing division of opinion about whether we're heading toward a catastrophic outcome in terms of our personal lives, in terms of the economy, effect on our values, how we raise our children, and others who are techno-optimists who think that the door is opening to just an incredibly wonderful future. And I know you're the latter, but I want you to explain to this audience why you have so much confidence that the future that's ahead, enabled by AI and superintelligence, is going to be a positive one for all of us, for what we believe in, the world we want to live in.
I will give you there are many ways I could answer that, but I'll give you maybe one example. So I think AI is now already, and before we get to superintelligence and what might be coming, AI is already good enough where any tasks that is repeatable can now be replaced by AI. So if you think of all the things in your lives that are these repetitive tasks, the administrative burden in your work, or the boredom of having to go and book your ticket to come here, click through these websites, and so for all of that now, technically speaking, could be replaced with AI. Now, it's going to take time. That's a multi-year process, but the technology is already there. I think where that leads organizationally is potentially to much smaller organizations, because if everything that can be repeated can be replaced by AI, what does that leave for humans to do? Well, I think it leaves the intrinsically human thing. It's the creativity, it's the professional judgment, it's the human contact. And what that means is we're going to need to rehumanize work. That the Industrial Revolution and the 200-300 years since have been a process of dehumanizing work. We've turned work into a series of often very mundane, repetitive tasks that become more and more specific. And the meaning in our lives has to be found outside of the 9 to 5. It's your hobbies, your family, your church, whatever it might be. I think AI is going to allow us to rehumanize work, refine meaning in what we do professionally for many, many people, because that will be quite literally the value that they still contribute.
That's a wonderful answer. We could go on, and maybe I invite everybody to do that as they leave here. I want to thank Louis after what has been, I can testify, a long 24 hours for doing this on short notice. It's a fascinating discussion, and we've all learned a lot about your company and about some of the biggest issues we're all facing. Thank you, Louis.
Thank you.